So a poorly designed sample can result in all sorts of bias. And some of these are not necessarily about the sample, but how we're surveying people. But we have some types of sampling bias here now. I have some questions where I ask about the specific types, but I've sort of gotten away from asking questions about the most prominent source of bias because a lot of times all three will be present. And there are more types of bias than what we talk about here. And instead, I leave these usually on test as open-ended questions about what's wrong with this particular method, sort of like the political scientist question, where there are points for mentioning all the different pieces, and if you don't get to all of them, then you might miss a point or two, as opposed to an all or nothing, which is the most prominent, which I found a lot of students would miss completely. So the three types of sampling bias we've already seen and already talked about, with the exception of one, are here. So we are under coverage. This is when we leave out a group of individuals based on our sampling method. We saw this with the census, leaving out homeless people. We saw this with the political scientist, her leaving out everyone who wasn't at her college or an undergraduate from her sampling scheme. We have non-response bias. So the political scientist did one thing right. She went and tried to select at random people from her college, but she ended up suffering from non-response bias because she had a lot of people that she selected who never sent back those surveys. So she's got non-response bias as well. And then we have response bias. Now this is some reason that people may not answer truthfully or may give information. This may be a vaguely worded survey question. A lot of the research questions or the survey questions that students do for the research project in this class end up being vaguely worded. And so they're open to interpretation by like, what do you mean? What is that? Like, is this GPA from high school? Is this GPA from last semester? Like, people aren't clear what's being asked for. And so there's some response bias there. Response bias can also be when we're asking questions that are potentially sensitive. So if you were to ask a woman, did you drink while you were pregnant? Based on the stigma that's associated with that, if we ask that verbally, we may not get a truthful answer based on the beliefs here in the US. So those are some reasons why from the interviewer part, we might see that. We also have issues where people might just lie intentionally. So that's an idea of response bias. I actually have a good link here down at the bottom of, oh no, I didn't. It's in my other class. I'll put it up on as a link after this YouTube video on types of how you have to write good survey questions, because you can write questions that are leading if you want to. You shouldn't. The order of in which survey questions are presented can also have a big impact on people's responses. So I'll try to find some good resources if you wanted to learn more about how people write surveys in misleading ways, to learn more about the response bias. But these are the three major types. Like I said, on a test, I try to leave this more open-ended now of like, here's the situation, explain what could go wrong. And I want you mostly, when you're thinking about what could go wrong, most of the time what students overlook, by the way, is undercoverage. They start talking about like people lying, people not responding. They get really into that part of it, and they don't really think about the sampling scheme and why there's sampling bias in terms of undercoverage. So if you leave that out entirely in that type of question, you would lose points.